today at Turkey's Middle East Technical University Faculty of Education to honor the memory of 43 Mexican student teachers, most of whom were tortured and killed. We are here today as part of an international campaign called Justice for Ayotzinapa. Today, we will first listen to a very enlightening talk by Professor Senese, who was kind enough to come here and give a speech on Ayotzinapa. And then we will light candles in front of the Faculty of Education to commemorate those student teachers. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Senese, who has come to talk to us about the Ayotzinapa memory, public education, and the complex language of freedom and exclusion. Professor Senese is a professor of educational foundations at Northern Arizona University in the USA. He came to Turkey in September 2014 on a Fulbright fellowship and is now offering a seminar on the intellectual history of education at Ankara University Faculty of Educational Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Senese.
Thank you, Yasmin, and thank you to everyone for coming. And I came to Turkey in September to be part of a community of students and teachers who maintain a tradition of democracy and education. I worked in a seminar where we have studied to uncover some important foundations of the spirit of free, rational inquiry. It's an education that is at the base of any democracy that's worthy of the name. I so appreciate the welcome from colleagues at the Ankara University College of Education Sciences to study and teach for this semester, and I regret my visit is nearing an end. I want to talk today about abstractions and ideas, and about light and imagination. A thin veil over a very concrete, hard, and sometimes merciless reality. The fires that fuel that light. Today we're thinking about young people who are teachers in training, and about a college of education in rural Mexico, grieving and angry for the murder of over 40 of their fellow students. In a nation and a world that is sick of violence and sick from violence. This college, Raul Isidro Burgos Rural Teachers College of Ayotzinapa, and those students represent everyone who cares about and works for justice and democracy and education. Many of you are young teachers in training, and you'll be thinking about your future, commitments, social, professional, personal. As I make these remarks, I welcome your questions, both during and after my talk. Consider these questions. What are your commitments? To what goals are you dedicated? Under what authority do we teach? Is the teacher's authority derived from pure power or from justice? What is the social contract we work from? Is it an agreement to educate for what John Dewey had called a more mature and autonomous participation in society? Or an agreement which accepts that some will not be educated, but merely disciplined, trained for servitude? In both my country and in Turkey, the social contract for education is embedded in what we've come to call the historic intellectual enlightenment. I'll be discussing light quite often in my talk, but also darkness. Both our nations participated during different revolutionary times in developing national commitments to a faith in human mind and human communities, which may use the power of reason, the methods of science, and rational inquiry. We all are the great humanity. These world historical commitments rejected the tyranny of feudalism toward a discourse we'll call the language of freedom. It lays in the stories of the world, the great literatures, the great formal libraries, and also in such booksellers as I saw in Kizilay not too long ago. slide forward. Glitch. Can we work on this for a moment to get these slides? I'll continue. The slides are more illustrative, and we'll continue. So this language of freedom that I'm talking about is, it lives in a fragile ecosystem and requires for its growth what a healthy plant may need: nutrition, where the life energy of the last generation's discourse is made available in song, in books, in speeches, in conversation freely. It requires oxygen for strong voices, and especially light for the sources of vision and imagination. I'd argue that this ecology is our work. For these are the conditions that our ancestors prepared, lived, died, and fought to defend. These make our communities of inquiry possible. Paying back their sacrifice, serving our intellectual debt to them, is part of this. It might seem odd that I talk about debt, for it's a troubled concept. I use it in its simplest form. Any discussion of enlightenment and education must not neglect one key foundational source of the Enlightenment tradition. It is the story of Socrates and his sacrifice and its inspiration for our intellectual freedom. That legacy of that ancient Athenian teacher looms large as a bedrock of free inquiry. And that classical story was energy for the ecology of the Enlightenment that made our institutions possible. It also must include Plato's masterwork, The Republic, for memorializing Socrates' contribution to education ideas. That book begins where justice is conditioned by what we owe. To society and to the young, what do we owe? It turns out we can't go very far studying what we owe without discussing education. Knowledge is the domain where our responsibilities, our social debt begins. And knowledge is a territory of memory and hope. Hope requires imagination. And the picture that you see here is blurred. It's hard to see. These students, are they entering our imagination for commemoration, or is the blurring a process of forgetting? So the archetypes that were developed by Plato through Socrates for analysis regard the problem of the truth, how power and privilege condition and discipline inquiry, and how this discipline's too often taken the form of unjust distortions of reality created by miseducation, serving not truth but power. Miseducation, a strange word, a wonderful word, a powerful word that you can't find in any English dictionary. Powerful teachers and their benefactors hated Socrates for his knowledge and his style. It put questions, dialogue, and not dogma, and politically palatable pronouncements at the heart of teaching. He was accused by them and convicted of corrupting the youth of Athens. While given the chance to flee to exile, Socrates instead chose to stay and continue teaching, even if that meant death. For in death, the final act would be to teach the city the consequences of its own unjust application of the law. With characteristic humor, he refused escape and exile, telling his followers who were waiting to spirit him away from Athens to Thessaly, "What would I do there? It's not my home. It's not my language. I won't be able to talk or teach. All I can do is eat." And so he stayed. And his execution and its publicity is part of the reason for the way our institutions still celebrate intellectual freedom. A teacher's debt is paid in the currency of open inquiry, making the pursuit of knowledge available to all, making no distinctions about the subjects to study or discuss, not selecting certain students and not others for the study. That was Socrates' way. For his enemies and all enemies of the language of freedom, the teacher's debt is paid when their language serves open inquiry, works toward enlightenment, which is the opposite of the corruption of the young. Preparing my talk, I've thought so much about the places where ideas live, and they live everywhere. And I love this picture that I randomly took in Kizilai of books on the ground for sale. They are part of the language of freedom. And another picture, which I considered changing to bring the clarity of the internet to you, but then I thought, no, I want the theme of memory and hope, whether realities are coming into or leaving our minds, how blurry they are. This is a group of citizens and students and their banner of the missing. They're not much unlike you. Here's some background and a short mention of their commitments. None of them have been seen since September 26th. It's believed their remains have been found, however. The precise motives for their killings are difficult to determine, but the students came from a school that's been training rural teachers and democratic activists for the better part of a century. Their commitment to helping small farmers and farm workers in the rugged, semi-feudal countryside, bringing education to them, has often put them at odds with the local powers that be. These students and their college defined their debt as Socrates did, working hard for open inquiry, talking with everyone, bringing knowledge to anyone, the poorest and the privileged. Survivors of this incident report that the police and thugs attacked the students 3 times. They sprayed one of the buses with machine gun fire. One eyewitness reported seeing the police force students out of another bus at gunpoint. In addition to the 3 killed, 17 were wounded, and they were the lucky ones. As many as 43 others were abducted, taken away in police vehicles. Here in our imagination, we see again a firelight. 200 Mexican Army soldiers, Marines, and police stood guard as the bodies of the fallen were exhumed from a hilly stretch of woodland. The bodies had been piled under dry branches and logs, doused with gasoline, and set afire. Testing is underway to identify them. 4 members of a drug cartel known as Guerreros Unidos that operates in Iguala, that state, told investigators that they knew and saw the 17 abducted. Abominable acts of violence have become common enough in Mexico that the public has built up a tolerance, a numbness. The details of this massacre have been especially difficult to absorb. This year, the students aged 19 to 23 had come to Iguala to pay their respects to other fallen students. They were going to an annual march in Mexico City in a sad irony to commemorate the horrific student massacre on the Mexican Plaza in Mexico City on October 2nd, 1968. When the government moved to crush the political opposition by gunning down scores, perhaps hundreds of students and others in a protest before the Summer Olympics. Now, being in Turkey, I've learned quite a lot. I've also learned how much more I perhaps may never know. I've learned of a long tradition, one that I envy, honoring those who gave their lives for freedom, especially political freedom. Lives seen in memorials, expressed in many places, on walls, in poems, honoring those who gave their lives for ideals of the people, gave their freedom. The ideals of the great humanity, they are so common here in a way I've never seen in the United States. I'm so honored to participate in this expression today, and honored by your presence, and apologetic that I don't have Turkish, and your patience with me is so respected. Thank you. My own country's presently witnessing protests and unrest that are so new and different, and I think are reflecting the growing crisis that is global now in inequality, poverty, and the exercise of police force. The killing of an unarmed African-American teenager, a long line of extrajudicial police brutalities. The fires in Ferguson, Missouri are shedding light on that subject. The protests are across America, their cries for justice, demanding that we call this killing by its right name: murder. Go back to the Republic, and the key notion in the Republic, the most famous of all these parables, the cave parable. And being in Turkey has brought me to recognition of light and its power, and also darkness and the world underground. The firelight, which exposes the truth, is complex. It has deep roots, historic roots sometimes. It's the sweet light from the open-air cafe, anywhere in the world, but especially here in Turkey, where coffee and tea generate ceremony of fellowship and debate. It's also a toxic light, bonfires of human beings in Holocaust, here in Iguala. Light and darkness and fire are on the horizon of struggle during my time. The cave establishes a metaphor of light and darkness in the Enlightenment project of the past 3 centuries, again, which is still dynamic and troubled in my country and in Turkey. Early in my visit, I heard more about the traditions of institutional academic sovereignty. Many education stakeholders, most in the U.S. who have gone almost silent, are not silent here. Unions, college departments, community movements, neighborhood associations. The right of public assembly is certainly contested terrain. It's fraught with conflict. With the Gezi resistance, the world saw an example of a people in motion. That phrase comes from a song in the 60s, when I was young, the time of social revolution in the U.S., with Ferguson. We see a glimmer of that happening again. But for me to see it since what critical educator Michael Appleton is the great restoration of neoconservatism in the U.S., I had to come to Turkey because I didn't see much democratic discourse in the U.S. and was so interested in what I saw here. I came on a Fulbright fellowship, part of the legacy of the Cold War, which I'll discuss also later. It's a scholars' exchange, free circulation of ideas, yet in my mind, knowing that it was part of U.S. efforts to domesticate client states in a dark part of the legacy, which includes the history beneath the tragedy of Ayotzinapa. We'll discuss that later. At an early Fulbright meeting with all the scholars, I was handed a folder. And it carried a slogan, a bold declaration, an arrogant declaration of the meaning of the U.S. investment in the Fulbright Foundation. It simply said on the cover, Fulbright, the price of empire. It made my skin crawl. So here I arrive in Ankara, September. I'm trying to find reference points. What in the world do I teach? Then tragedy happened. 18 miners were trapped in another work site, and immediately protests unfolded. What was I seeing? I was informed that this had opened a wound of an earlier colossal tragedy of neglect, where over 300 miners had died. One day there was a small clash at the entrance of our campus. Thoughtful students rushed me to a cafe for safety. Later in the week, my wife Jamie and I broke a Fulbright warning, which told us not to go near protests, and we went to a small local demonstration in Body Kent to support the trapped workers. We sat in the cold, listening to songs of remembrance, poetry, memorial music of freedom, coming from little loudspeakers. We sat outside at what was described to us as the Turkish Walmart, as a small bonfire was built out of packing crates. And I thought then about the light from that little fire. I thought about minds, including the language of music and freedom from my own country in the middle of the 20th century. I was coming to realize that this music of remembrance, remembering martyrs, honoring, was alive and real in Turkey. Yet in my own country, that same energy has faded to a whisper, suffocated by censorship, by racism, consumerism, political and historical amnesia. Early in the semester, before that recent disaster, as an example of a once thriving legacy of democratic voice in the U.S., I had coincidentally come to class to share a few YouTube selections from Woody Guthrie, who had sung about the martyred Joe Hill, an immigrant miner, an organizer and teacher, whose songs and last words were inspiration for activists of my generation. In part because of his last words. He went to organize in a mine and to teach a class on organizing. And he went down into the mine, and the mine collapsed, and he was dying. With his last words, he looked at his followers. He said, "Don't mourn me, boys. Organize." I use this as an example of the language of freedom during which the mid-century was censored, banned from schools, branded as communist propaganda music. During that time, thousands of intellectuals, artists, teachers, musicians, careers were destroyed by charges of communism in the U.S. Yes, organize, but how? Against what powers? On what authority do we frame our social and educational debt? We'll talk here a little bit about this language of freedom, but how? Millions of students are organizing for it, and here some few paid the ultimate price. That night in Body Kent, I figured it was time to talk about that other world of firelight and darkness, the underground world of Plato's cave. In that cave, there's firelight burning behind ordinary people, and it's casting shadows of objects that are moving behind them. Many of you know this story because it is so classic. They're chained together. They turn to each other for agreement, for disagreement, for honor, for punishment. That's their reality. In time, a few make their way out to see the real source of the light and the images on the wall. That they're distortions. They're not real. They're not at all like the true objects from which these shadows are formed. It's a difficult, painful process of communicating to the cave dwellers the source of the light and the truth. And it's the essential problem in education. In Ferguson, these fires are used as another expression for the cave dwellers. And that is, the fires are burning as part of the basic criminality of the black underclasses. These are fires that will burn your property next. For others, these fires are extensions of the fury generated by generations. Fires that consume black bodies in thousands of lynchings, hangings of innocents, in an earlier generation of radical exclusion and oppression. Black leader Martin Luther King, like Socrates, also chose danger and eventually died at the hands of oppressors, in part to continue teaching. In that year, 1968, the same year, 1968, such an important year, when so many died in Mexico City, so many teachers. Dr. King loved W.E.B. Du Bois, who coined the term, the language of freedom. He used it to say, every child, from the poorest to the richest, deserves a liberal education, a freeing education. I couldn't help but think about how there is so much activity and struggle for the language of freedom in Turkey, and yet reflect back on the silenced voices in my own country, like Woody Guthrie, whose songs of work and struggle were censored and are still censored. Dr. King adapted a phrase from Theodore Parker, a white Christian. Theodore Parker had said something to the effect about justice, that issue that is the study of the Republic. Justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, he said, but it bends toward justice. I mentioned King and Parker's position as religious leaders to highlight an issue. Moral education is also deeply rooted in religious experience and religious language. What's important is that within world historical religious traditions, such as Christianity, there is support for oppression and blindness and hatred for those who also claim the same religion for its source of justice and light. It still provides a home for those who hate black Americans, and provides a language of condemnation on the doorsteps of churches in some parts of the U.S. As teachers develop their own commitments, they must contend with this confusing paradox.